The evening air carried the scent of jasmine and possibility as Carl Stewart found himself walking beside Douglas Hughes down the quiet residential street, their footsteps creating a gentle rhythm on the sidewalk. What had started as a casual suggestion for fresh air had somehow transformed into this charged moment, with Douglas matching his pace step for step, their shoulders occasionally brushing as they navigated the uneven pavement. Carl's heart hammered against his ribs as they approached his apartment building, the yellow glow of the porch light growing larger with each step, and he wondered if Douglas could hear the thunderous beating that seemed to echo in the silence between them. They had been walking for 20 minutes now, weaving through the neighborhood streets in what should have been a simple loop back to the coffee shop where they had left their cars. Instead, Douglas had quietly fallen into step beside him, and when Carl had mentioned he lived just a few blocks away, Douglas had simply nodded and continued walking in that direction. The conversation had grown softer, more intimate somehow, filled with longer pauses and meaningful glances that Carl was afraid to interpret too deeply. Now, as they stood before his building, Carl fumbled for his keys while trying to process what was happening. Douglas stood close enough that Carl could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could catch the subtle scent of his cologne mixed with something uniquely him, something clean and masculine that made Carl's pulse quicken every time he caught it during their late-night work sessions. When Carl finally managed to extract his keys from his pocket, his hands were trembling slightly, the metal jingling softly in the evening air, and he hoped Douglas wouldn't notice the way his fingers shook as he sorted through the small collection of keys. But as he turned toward the door, Douglas's hand gently touched his arm, causing him to freeze mid-motion. The contact was electric, sending warmth shooting up Carl's arm and straight to his chest, where it settled like a glowing ember. Quote, Douglas said, his voice barely above a whisper, and there was something in the way he said his name that made Carl's breath catch in his throat. The words seemed to hang in the air between them, weighted with months of unspoken longing and carefully controlled desire. I need to tell you something. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you are watching from and hype this video in the comments. But to understand how they had arrived at this moment, standing on Carl's doorstep with the weight of unspoken words hanging between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed, we need to go back to where it all began. 3 months earlier, when Carl Stewart first walked into the marketing firm where Douglas Hughes had been working for 2 years, establishing himself as one of their most promising account managers, with an intuitive understanding of client psychology that impressed even the senior partners. Carl had been the new hire, fresh out of graduate school with a degree in digital marketing and a nervous energy that seemed to fill whatever room he entered. His portfolio was impressive, filled with innovative campaign concepts and creative solutions that had caught the attention of the hiring committee, but he carried himself with the uncertainty of someone still discovering his professional identity. Douglas had been assigned as his mentor, tasked with showing him the ropes and helping him navigate the complex world of client relationships and campaign strategies. From the moment they shook hands in the conference room that first Monday morning, Carl had felt something shift inside him, a recognition that he couldn't quite name, but that left him slightly breathless and wondering if the air conditioning in the building was working properly. Douglas Hughes was everything Carl had never allowed himself to want. Tall and lean with dark hair that always looked perfectly tousled, as if he had just run his fingers through it in a moment of concentration. Douglas carried himself with a confidence that Carl found both intimidating and incredibly attractive. His laugh was infectious, filling the office with warmth and drawing people to him like moths to a flame. And he had a way of making everyone around him feel like they were the most important person in the room. But it was his eyes that had captured Carl's attention from the beginning. Deep brown with flecks of gold that seemed to catch the light when he was passionate about something, creating tiny sparks that Carl found himself watching for during their daily interactions. For the first few weeks, Carl had convinced himself that what he was feeling was simply admiration for a colleague, gratitude for Douglas's patience as he learned the systems and processes that governed their fast-paced work environment. Douglas had a gift for explaining complex concepts in ways that made sense, breaking down complicated client requirements into manageable tasks, and he never made Carl feel stupid for asking questions, even when they were questions he probably should have known the answers to based on his graduate coursework. They fell into an easy rhythm of working together, staying late to finish presentations, grabbing coffee between meetings to discuss strategy, and slowly building what Carl told himself was just a professional relationship founded on mutual respect and shared dedication to excellence. But as the weeks turned into months, Carl found himself looking forward to their interactions with an intensity that surprised and sometimes alarmed him. He would arrive at the office early just to see Douglas at his desk, coffee in hand, reviewing the day's schedule with that focused expression that made Carl's stomach flutter with something he refused to acknowledge. The way Douglas's brow furrowed slightly when he was concentrating, the way he absently chewed on the end of his pen when he was thinking through a problem, the way his face lit up when he had a breakthrough moment. Carl cataloged these details without meaning to, storing them away like precious treasures that he could revisit during the quiet moments of his day. He began volunteering for projects that would require them to work closely together, telling himself it was for the experience, for the learning opportunities that would advance his career, when really he just wanted more time in Douglas's presence. He found excuses to stop by Douglas's desk with questions that he could have answered himself with a little research, lingering longer than necessary to discuss points that were already clear, savoring the way Douglas would give him his full attention, those golden-flecked eyes focused entirely on him, as if nothing else in the bustling office mattered. The first crack in Carl's carefully constructed denial came during a particularly stressful week in October, when the autumn light was already growing shorter and the office took on a different energy as everyone prepared for the busy holiday season ahead. They had been working on a major campaign for a new client, a luxury hotel chain that wanted to rebrand their image to appeal to younger travelers, pulling long hours and surviving on takeout and determination. Carl had thrown himself into the creative aspects of the campaign, developing mood boards and conceptual frameworks that impressed both Douglas and their supervisor, while Douglas handled the strategic planning and client communications with his usual skill and diplomacy. It was nearly midnight on a Thursday when they finally finished the presentation, both of them slumped in their chairs in the conference room they had commandeered for the week, exhausted but satisfied with their work. The building was quiet around them, most of their colleagues having gone home hours earlier, and the cleaning crew had already been through their floor, leaving behind the scent of industrial disinfectant and the soft hum of the ventilation system. Douglas had suggested they celebrate with a drink at the bar across the street, and Carl had agreed without hesitation, his pulse quickening at the prospect of spending more time alone with Douglas outside the confines of their professional relationship. They gathered their materials and made their way down to the lobby, the elevator ride passing in comfortable silence as they both processed the completion of weeks of intensive work. The bar was dimly lit and nearly empty, with soft jazz playing in the background and the comfortable atmosphere of a place where people went to unwind after long days. Exposed brick walls were lined with vintage photographs of the city, and small candles flickered on each table, creating intimate pools of warm light. They found a booth in the corner and ordered drinks, Douglas choosing whiskey neat while Carl opted for a beer, and for the first time since they had started working together, their conversation drifted away from work entirely. Douglas talked about his college years, about the creative writing degree he had abandoned in favor of marketing because it seemed more practical, more stable, more likely to provide the kind of financial security his parents had always emphasized as important. He spoke with a wistfulness that Carl recognized, the regret of someone who had chosen security over passion, who wondered what might have been if he had been brave enough to follow his heart instead of his head. His fingers traced patterns on the table as he spoke, and Carl found himself mesmerized by the graceful movement of his hands, by the way the candle light played across his features. Carl found himself sharing stories about his own journey, about the art classes he had loved in college but never pursued seriously because he had been told they weren't practical, about the novel he had started writing in graduate school but never finished because he had convinced himself he didn't have the talent or the time to do it justice. He talked about the creative projects he had abandoned over the years, the dreams he had set aside in favor of more conventional paths, and Douglas listened with an intensity that made Carl feel truly heard for the first time in years. As the evening wore on and the alcohol loosened their tongues, their conversation became more personal, more intimate, touching on subjects they had never discussed in the office. Douglas mentioned his ex-girlfriend Sandra, who had broken up with him 6 months earlier because she said he was emotionally unavailable, always holding something back. Never fully present, even when they were together. Carl listened to the pain in Douglas's voice as he described the relationship, how Sandra had accused him of going through the motions without ever really being present, of treating their relationship like another item on his to-do list rather than a source of joy and connection. The thing is, Douglas said, swirling his whiskey in the glass and watching the amber liquid catch the candlelight, she wasn't wrong. I did feel like I was playing a part, like I was trying to be the person I thought I should be rather than who I actually was. But I didn't know how to explain that to her because I didn't understand it myself. I kept thinking that if I just tried harder, if I just focused more on making her happy, the feelings would come. But they never did. Not really. Carl had wanted to reach across the table to offer some gesture of comfort, but he had kept his hands wrapped around his beer bottle instead, afraid that any touch might reveal too much about his own feelings. Maybe you just hadn't found the right person yet, he had said, the words coming out more quietly than he had intended. Douglas had looked at him then with an expression that Carl couldn't quite read, something searching and vulnerable that made Carl's chest tighten with an emotion he didn't want to name. Quote 5. Douglas had replied, but there was something in his voice, a note of uncertainty that suggested he was beginning to question more than just his choice in partners, beginning to wonder if the problem wasn't who he was dating, but what he was looking for entirely. That night marked a turning point in their relationship, though neither of them acknowledged it directly. Their interactions at work became charged with an undercurrent of something deeper than professional camaraderie, something that hummed beneath the surface of their daily conversations like an electrical current waiting to be completed. Douglas would find excuses to stop by Carl's desk, leaning against the partition as they discussed projects, standing close enough that Carl could feel the heat of his body, could catch that intoxicating scent that had become so familiar. Carl would catch Douglas watching him during meetings, and when their eyes met, neither would look away immediately, creating moments of connection that left Carl's pulse racing and his concentration scattered for the rest of the day. The subtle flirtation escalated gradually over the following weeks, like a slow dance where each partner was afraid to take the lead, but neither wanted the music to stop. Douglas began suggesting lunch together more frequently, choosing restaurants where they could sit across from each other and talk without the interruptions of the office, where they could let their conversations wander into personal territory without worrying about curious colleagues overhearing. Their conversations during these lunches grew increasingly intimate, with Douglas sharing details about his childhood, his family dynamics, his dreams and fears, while Carl found himself opening up in ways he never had before, revealing aspects of his personality and history that he had kept carefully guarded for years. It was during one of these lunches at a small Italian place downtown with checkered tablecloths and the warm aroma of garlic and herbs filling the air that Douglas first brought up the topic that would change everything between them. They were sharing a plate of pasta, the conversation flowing easily between work gossip and weekend plans, when Douglas suddenly grew quiet, his fork hovering over his plate as if he had forgotten he was holding it. The restaurant was busy around them, filled with a lunchtime crowd of office workers and business meetings, but their corner table felt isolated, private, as if they existed in their own bubble of intimate conversation. Carl noticed the change in Douglas's demeanor immediately, the way his shoulders tensed slightly, the way his eyes grew more serious. "Go to that then," Douglas said, his voice careful, measured, as if he were approaching dangerous territory and wanted to make sure he didn't misstep. Carl nodded, his heart already beginning to race at the serious tone in Douglas's voice, at the way Douglas was looking at him with an intensity that made him feel exposed and vulnerable. "Code 7?" Douglas asked, the words coming out in a rush, as if he had been holding them back and finally couldn't contain them any longer. His cheeks flushed slightly as soon as the words left his mouth, and Carl could see the immediate regret in his expression, the fear that he had pushed too far, too fast. The question hung in the air between them like a bridge. Neither was sure they were ready to cross, and Carl felt the world tilt slightly on its axis. He had been wondering exactly that for months now, ever since he had started working with Douglas, but he had never allowed himself to voice the thought, even in the privacy of his own mind. The question forced him to confront feelings he had been carefully avoiding, desires he had been pushing down every time they surfaced. I, Carl started, then stopped, unsure how to respond. The honest answer was yes, he had been wondering. Had been lying awake at night thinking about Douglas's smile, about the way his hand had felt when it accidentally brushed against Carl's while they were reaching for the same document, about what it might feel like to kiss him. But admitting that felt like crossing a line he wasn't sure he was ready to cross, like acknowledging something about himself that would change everything. Douglas seemed to sense his hesitation and quickly backtracked, his face growing even redder as he realized how his question might have sounded. Kotaban, Kotanda, Carl said quickly, reaching across the table to touch Douglas's hand before he could stop himself. The contact sent electricity shooting up his arm, and he saw Douglas's eyes widen slightly at the touch, saw something flicker in his expression that looked like hope mixed with fear. It was a lie, and they both knew it, but Douglas didn't push. Instead, he turned his hand palm up beneath Carl's, their fingers intertwining for just a moment before Carl pulled away, his face flushing with heat that had nothing to do with the warm restaurant. Quote, Douglas admitted, his voice quiet enough that Carl had to lean forward to hear him over the ambient noise of the restaurant. Quote, I knew. Carl's heart was pounding so hard he was sure Douglas could hear it, sure that everyone in the restaurant could hear it. And what conclusions have you come to? Douglas was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the table between them, on the remains of their shared meal that had grown cold while they talked. When he finally looked up, his expression was vulnerable in a way that Carl had never seen before, open and uncertain and brave. I think maybe I've been looking for connection in all the wrong places, he said finally. I think maybe I've been trying to fit myself into a life that was never meant for me, trying to force feelings that were never going to come naturally. The conversation had shifted something fundamental between them, creating an awareness that neither could ignore, a new layer of understanding that colored every subsequent interaction. In the days that followed, Carl found himself hyper-conscious of every moment spent with Douglas, analyzing every glance, every casual touch, every moment of lingering eye contact. Douglas seemed to be doing the same, and their office dynamic became charged with a tension that was both exhilarating and terrifying. Their colleagues began to notice the change, the way Carl and Douglas seemed to orbit each other during meetings, the way their collaboration had taken on an intensity that went beyond professional dedication. Sarah from accounting commented to her cubicle mate that they seemed to have developed their own private language, communicating with looks and subtle gestures that excluded everyone else. Tom from the creative department joked that they were like an old married couple, finishing each other's sentences and anticipating each other's needs with uncanny accuracy. But Carl and Douglas were too caught up in their own private drama to notice the speculation around them. They were learning to navigate this new awareness, this acknowledgement of attraction that had fundamentally changed the nature of their relationship. Every shared coffee break became an opportunity for deeper conversation. Every late-night work session became charged with possibility. Every accidental touch became a moment of electric connection that left them both breathless and confused. The breakthrough came 3 weeks later during the company holiday party. The event was held at an upscale hotel downtown, with an open bar and a DJ playing music that encouraged dancing, but not much actual dancing was happening. The ballroom was decorated with elegant winter themes, white lights strung along the walls and centerpieces of silver and blue that caught the light from the chandeliers overhead. Most of the staff had dressed up for the occasion, and Carl had spent an embarrassing amount of time choosing his outfit, settling on a dark blue suit that he hoped made him look sophisticated and confident. Carl had been standing near the windows, nursing a glass of wine and watching his colleagues mingle when Douglas appeared beside him. Douglas was wearing a charcoal gray suit that fit him perfectly, emphasizing his lean frame and making his eyes look even more striking than usual. Carl felt his breath catch as he took in Douglas's appearance, the way the formal attire transformed him into someone even more attractive than the man Carl saw every day at the office. Quote 17, Douglas asked, his own drink in hand, a whiskey that caught the light from the chandeliers. Quote 17. Carl admitted, grateful for the excuse to look away from Douglas's face before he said something he would regret. I'm better with small groups, intimate conversations. These big events always make me feel like I'm performing rather than actually enjoying myself. Douglas smiled at that, and Carl realized how his words might have sounded, how the emphasis on intimate might have revealed more than he intended. I know what you mean, Douglas said, moving slightly closer so that their shoulders were almost touching. Sometimes I feel like I'm performing at these things anyway, playing the part of the social, outgoing guy everyone expects me to be. It's exhausting, trying to be on all the time. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the party unfold around them. The hotel had floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of the city lights below, and Carl found himself thinking about how beautiful Douglas looked in the soft lighting, how the golden glow from the chandeliers seemed to highlight the sharp angles of his face, the elegant line of his neck, the way his hair caught the light when he turned his head. "Do you want to get some air?" Douglas asked suddenly, and Carl nodded without hesitation, setting down his wine glass and following Douglas toward the exit. They made their way to the hotel's rooftop terrace, which was largely empty except for a few other party guests who were more interested in their own conversations than in Carl and Douglas. The December air was crisp but not uncomfortably cold, and the city spread out below them like a carpet of lights, twinkling and shifting in the darkness. The terrace was beautifully landscaped, with strategically placed lighting that created intimate spaces among the potted trees and decorative planters. Douglas moved to the railing and leaned against it, his profile silhouetted against the night sky. The wind ruffled his hair slightly, and Carl found himself mesmerized by the way the city lights played across his features, creating shadows and highlights that made him look like a work of art. Carl joined him, standing close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and for a moment they just stood there in silence, breathing in the cool air and listening to the distant sounds of traffic below, the muffled music from the party several floors beneath them. Code 24, Douglas said finally, his voice quiet but clear, cutting through the ambient noise of the city. There was something different in his tone, something more serious and vulnerable than Carl had ever heard before. Carl's heart stopped. He turned to face Douglas, who was still looking out at the city, his hands gripping the railing with a tension that Carl could see in the line of his shoulders, in the way his knuckles had gone white against the dark metal. "I think I'm falling for you," Douglas said, the words barely audible over the wind, but each syllable hit Carl like a physical blow. "I think I have been for a while now, and I don't know what to do about it. I've never felt this way about anyone before, man or woman, and it's terrifying and exhilarating, and I can't stop thinking about you." The confession hung between them like a bridge neither was ready to cross, shimmering with possibility and danger in equal measure. Carl felt his breath catch in his throat, felt the world shift and realign around this moment, this truth that Douglas had finally spoken aloud. All the careful control he had been maintaining, all the walls he had built around his feelings, came crashing down in an instant. "Douglas," Carl whispered. And when Douglas finally turned to look at him, Carl could see the vulnerability in his eyes, the fear and hope warring in his expression, the way his lips parted slightly, as if he wanted to say more but didn't know how. But Ananta Douglas continued, his words coming faster now, as if he needed to get them all out before he lost his nerve. Quote to him, Carl reached out then, his hand finding Douglas's on the railing, their fingers intertwining just as they had that day at lunch. But this time, neither of them pulled away. This time, Carl held on as if Douglas were an anchor in a storm he hadn't realized he was drowning in. Carl admitted, his voice shaking slightly with the weight of the confession. Quote 31. Douglas turned fully toward him then, their hands still connected, and Carl could see the relief washing over his features like sunrise after a long dark night. Quote to 32, quote to 30 men, Carl confirmed, and then Douglas was stepping closer, his free hand coming up to cup Carl's face, his thumb brushing across Carl's cheekbone in a gesture so tender it made Carl's eyes flutter closed. The touch was everything Carl had imagined, and more, warm and gentle, and full of a reverence that took his breath away. "Can I kiss you?" Douglas whispered, and Carl's eyes opened to find Douglas watching him with an intensity that made his knees weak, made his heart pound so hard he was sure it would burst from his chest. Quote 35, Carl breathed, and then Douglas's lips were on his, soft and warm and perfect. The kiss, started a gentle tentative, as if they were both afraid that too much pressure might shatter the moment, might wake them from a dream they weren't ready to leave. But as Carl's hands found their way to Douglas's chest, as Douglas's arm wrapped around Carl's waist and pulled him closer, the kiss deepened, became more certain, more desperate. Carl had been kissed before, had thought he understood what desire felt like, but nothing had prepared him for this, for the way Douglas's mouth moved against his, for the way his entire body seemed to come alive under Douglas's touch. Douglas tasted like whiskey and possibility, like everything Carl had been denying in himself for months finally made real. His lips were soft but insistent, moving against Carl's with a skill and passion that made Carl's head spin. When Douglas's tongue traced the seam of Carl's lips, asking for permission, Carl granted it without hesitation, opening to him completely. The kiss grew hungrier, more intense, as months of suppressed desire finally found release. Carl's hands fisted in the fabric of Douglas's suit jacket, pulling him closer, needing more contact, more connection. Douglas's hand tangled in Carl's hair, angling his head to deepen the kiss further, and Carl made a soft sound of pleasure that was swallowed by Douglas's mouth. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Douglas rested his forehead against Carl's, their breath mingling in the cool air between them. Carl could see his own wonder and amazement reflected in Douglas's eyes, could feel the way Douglas's hands tremble slightly where they touched him. Quote 36. Douglas whispered, and Carl could only nod in agreement, too overwhelmed by sensation and emotion to form words. The kiss had been everything he had imagined and nothing like he had expected, both familiar and completely foreign, like coming home and embarking on an adventure at the same time. They stayed like that for a long moment, holding each other on the rooftop terrace, while the party continued several floors below them, while the city hummed with life around them. Carl felt as if he had been holding his breath for months and could finally exhale, as if a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying had been lifted from his shoulders. The fear and uncertainty that had plagued him for so long were still there, but they were overshadowed now by a sense of rightness, of finally being exactly where he was supposed to be. The weeks that followed were a careful dance of discovery and navigation, filled with stolen moments and secret glances that made Carl feel like a teenager with his first crush. They agreed to keep their relationship private at work, at least until they figured out what it meant and where it was going. But outside the office, they began exploring this new dynamic between them with a mixture of excitement and trepidation that colored every interaction. Their first official date was the following Saturday, a simple dinner at a quiet restaurant across town where they were unlikely to run into anyone from work. Carl had spent an hour getting ready, changing clothes 3 times before settling on dark jeans and a sweater that he hoped struck the right balance between casual and attractive. When Douglas picked him up, wearing a similar outfit that made him look relaxed and approachable in a way that his work attire never quite achieved, Carl felt his heart skip a beat all over again. The dinner was everything Carl had hoped it would be and more. Away from the constraints of their professional relationship, they were free to explore the attraction that had been building between them for months. Douglas was attentive and charming, asking questions about Carl's interests and dreams that went far beyond anything they had discussed at work. Carl found himself sharing stories about his childhood, his family, his hopes for the future, while Douglas listened with an intensity that made him feel truly seen and understood. Quote 37. Douglas admitted over dessert, his hand resting on the table close enough to Carl's that their fingers could brush when they reached for their coffee cups. I keep thinking I should be more nervous, more uncertain about all this, but it just feels right. Being here with you, talking like this, it's the most natural thing in the world. Carl smiled, feeling a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the wine they had shared. I know what you mean. I was terrified before you picked me up tonight, convinced I would say something stupid or awkward. But being with you is easy. It's like we've been doing this for years. Their relationship continued to deepen over the following weeks, each date revealing new layers of compatibility and connection. They discovered shared interests in art and literature, spent hours discussing books and movies and music, debating everything from politics to philosophy with a passion that often led to heated but respectful disagreements that only seemed to draw them closer together. But it wasn't just the intellectual connection that made their relationship special. Douglas was everything Carl had imagined he would be as a partner and more. He was attentive and generous, always checking to make sure Carl was comfortable, always asking what he wanted, what felt good. But he was also passionate and intense, bringing to their physical relationship the same focus and dedication he brought to everything else in his life. Their first night together happened 3 weeks after their first kiss, after an evening spent at Carl's apartment, cooking dinner and talking about their respective journeys of self-discovery. The transition from conversation to physical intimacy felt natural, inevitable, like the logical conclusion of weeks of building tension and desire. Douglas was patient and careful, understanding that this was new territory for both of them in different ways. For Carl, it was his first experience with a man, his first time exploring desires he had only recently acknowledged. For Douglas, it was his first relationship that felt completely authentic, completely right, free from the performance and pretense that had characterized his previous romantic encounters. They moved slowly, savoring each touch, each kiss, each moment of discovery. Douglas's hands were gentle but sure as they explored Carl's body, mapping every curve and plane with a reverence that made Carl feel cherished and desired in ways he had never experienced before. When they finally came together completely, it was with a tenderness and passion that left them both breathless, their bodies moving together in perfect synchronization as if they had been created for this moment, for each other. For Carl, who had spent most of his adult life feeling like he was going through the motions in relationships, the connection with Douglas was revelatory. Every touch felt electric. Every kiss felt like coming home. And every night they spent together deepened his understanding of what it meant to truly want someone, to be truly wanted in return. But it wasn't just the physical connection that transformed Carl's understanding of love and relationships. Douglas was also his intellectual equal, someone who could challenge his ideas and make him think in new ways, someone who appreciated his creativity and encouraged him to pursue the artistic interests he had abandoned. They would spend hours talking about books and movies and art, debating philosophy and politics, sharing their dreams and fears with an openness that Carl had never experienced before. 3 months into their relationship, they had fallen into a comfortable rhythm of spending most evenings together, either at Carl's apartment or Douglas's house across town. It was a Tuesday night in March when they found themselves at Carl's place, cooking dinner together and talking about their day, when Douglas brought up a topic that had been weighing on his mind for weeks. Quote 40, Douglas said as he chopped vegetables for their salad, his knife moving in steady, precise strokes that spoke to his careful nature. Quote 40, Carl looked up from the pasta he was stirring, surprised by the sudden shift in conversation. Steam rose from the pot, carrying the scent of garlic and herbs, and he could hear the soft sizzle of the chicken they were preparing in the pan beside it. Douglas set down his knife and turned to face Carl fully, his expression serious but determined. Quote to Fury, he said, his voice carrying a conviction that Carl had never heard before. Quote 44, Carl felt his heart swell at Douglas's words, but he also felt a flutter of anxiety about the potential complications. What about the company policy? What about the potential complications with our working relationship? What if people react badly? We'll figure it out, Douglas said, moving closer to Carl and taking his hands, his thumbs brushing over Carl's knuckles in a gesture that was both comforting and reassuring. 47. Carl looked into Douglas's eyes and saw the sincerity there, the love and commitment that had been growing between them over the past months. He thought about how exhausting it had been to maintain their professional facade, how many times he had wanted to reach for Douglas's hand or kiss him goodbye after a meeting, only to remember where they were and pull back. He thought about the careful distance they maintained in public, the way they had to edit their conversations and monitor their body language to avoid revealing the truth of their relationship. Quote 48, Carl said finally, his voice growing stronger with conviction. Quote 40, Douglas smiled then, that brilliant smile that had first captured Carl's attention, and leaned in to kiss him softly. Good, he whispered against Carl's lips. Quote 51. The conversation with their supervisor went better than either of them had expected. The company had policies in place for workplace relationships, requiring disclosure and some adjustments to their working arrangements to avoid conflicts of interest. But there was no prohibition against dating a colleague. Their boss, a practical woman in her 50s who had seen it all during her decades in corporate America, simply nodded when they explained the situation and asked them to fill out the appropriate paperwork. Quote 52. She had said with a slight smile that suggested she had been expecting this conversation for months. Quote 53. The reaction from their coworkers was similarly positive to him, with most people expressing happiness for them and admitting they had suspected something was going on for months. Sarah from accounting confessed that she had been taking bets on when they would finally get together, while Tom from creative claimed he had known from the first week that they were perfect for each other. A few people seemed surprised, particularly those who had known Douglas during his relationship with Sandra, but the general consensus was one of support and acceptance. Quote 54, their colleague Jessica said during a group lunch the week after they made their announcement. Quote 55, for Carl, who had spent most of his life feeling like he was living slightly outside of himself, watching his life happen rather than fully participating in it, the experience of being open about his relationship with Douglas was transformative. He felt more confident, more settled, more like the person he was meant to be. The anxiety and self-doubt that had plagued him for years began to fade, replaced by a sense of certainty and belonging that he had never experienced before. Douglas seemed to undergo a similar transformation. The restlessness that had characterized his previous relationships disappeared, replaced by a contentment and focus that impressed everyone around him. He threw himself into his work with renewed energy, but he also began pursuing some of the creative interests he had abandoned, taking evening writing classes and working on short stories in his spare time. Quote 56, their supervisor observed during Carl's quarterly review, whatever you're doing in your personal life, it's clearly working for you professionally as well. Your collaboration has always been strong, but now there's an energy and creativity in your work that's really impressive. Their relationship continued to deepen over the following months. They talked about moving in together, about long-term plans and shared goals, about the future they wanted to build as a couple. Carl had never been in a relationship that felt so stable, so right, so much like home. The uncertainty and fear that had characterized his previous romantic experiences were replaced by a sense of security and trust that allowed him to be completely himself. It was during one of their evening walks, 6 months after their first kiss on the hotel rooftop, that they found themselves discussing the nature of love and attraction, the journey that had brought them together, the ways their relationship had changed them both. I keep thinking about that lunch when you asked me if I'd ever been attracted to men, Carl said as they strolled through the park near his apartment. Their hands intertwined as they walked beneath the canopy of trees that were just beginning to show their autumn colors. I was so scared to answer honestly, so terrified of what it might mean about me, about my future, about everything I thought I knew about myself. Douglas smiled at the memory, squeezing Carl's hand gently. Quote 60, he admitted. Quote 62. Quote Sir Carl said, stopping to face Douglas beneath a street lamp that cast golden light through the falling leaves around them. Quote, I said, quote, Harn, Douglas replied, reaching up to brush a leaf from Carl's hair. Even though you lied and said you'd never thought about it, seriously. Carl laughed, the sound echoing in the quiet park around them. I was thinking about it constantly. I was thinking about you constantly. I just didn't know how to admit that to myself, let alone to you. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, their hands intertwined, their steps synchronized. The evening was warm and pleasant, with a gentle breeze rustling the leaves overhead and the distant sounds of other couples and families enjoying the park. Carl felt a deep sense of contentment as they moved through the familiar landscape, a feeling of being exactly where he belonged. You know what I love most about us? Douglas said suddenly, stopping beneath a street lamp and turning to face Carl with an expression of such tenderness that it made Carl's heart skip a beat. Quote 68. Carl asked, smiling at the serious expression on Douglas's face, at the way the lamplight caught the gold flecks in his eyes and made them sparkle. I love that we found each other when we weren't looking, Douglas said, his hands coming up to frame Carl's face in a gesture that had become so familiar, so cherished. With 70. Carl felt his heart swell with emotion, with gratitude for this man who had seen something in him that he hadn't even seen in himself. I love that too, he said softly. I love that you saw something in me that I didn't even see in myself. I love that you made me feel safe enough to explore who I really am, to question everything I thought I knew about myself and my desires. I love that you never pushed me to be ready before I was ready, that you let me figure things out at my own pace. Douglas stepped closer, their bodies almost touching now, their face inches apart in the golden glow of the street lamp. I love that you're brave, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I love that you took a chance on me, on us, even when it was scary and uncertain. I love that you trusted me enough to be vulnerable, to let me see all the parts of yourself that you usually keep hidden. I love that you're patient, Carl replied, his hands coming up to rest on Douglas's chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath his palms. Quote 76. They were standing very close now, their faces inches apart, their breath mingling in the warm evening air. Carl could see the love in Douglas's eyes, could feel it radiating from his touch. And he marveled at how far they had come from that first day in the conference room, when he had been just another new hire and Douglas had been just another colleague assigned to show him the ropes. I love you, Douglas whispered. And Carl's heart skipped a beat, just as it had the first time Douglas had said those words, just as it did every time he heard them. Quote 78. Carl replied, and then Douglas was kissing him, soft and sweet and full of promise, right there beneath the street lamp in the middle of the park where anyone could see them. And for the first time in his life, Carl didn't care who might be watching, didn't worry about what people might think. He was exactly where he belonged, with exactly the person he was meant to be with, and nothing else mattered. When they broke apart, they resumed walking, their conversation turning to practical matters like weekend plans and grocery lists. But Carl felt the warmth of Douglas's declaration settling into his bones, becoming part of the foundation of contentment and security that their relationship had built within him. As they approached Carl's apartment building, the same building where they now stood on this particular evening in June, Carl found himself thinking about how much had changed since that first nervous day at work, how much he had grown and discovered about himself through loving Douglas and being loved in return. The journey from that first handshake in the conference room to this moment on his doorstep had been filled with uncertainty and fear, with moments of doubt and hesitation, but it had also been filled with joy and discovery, with the gradual revelation of a love that felt both surprising and inevitable. Now, as Douglas's hand touched his arm outside his apartment, as those familiar brown eyes searched his face in the yellow glow of the porch light, Carl felt the same flutter of anticipation he had felt that first night on the hotel rooftop, the same sense of standing on the threshold of something beautiful and transformative. Carl, Douglas said again, his voice carrying that same note of vulnerability that had characterized all their most important conversations, that had made Carl fall in love with him in the first place. I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about wanting to take the next step. Carl's heart began to race as he remembered their conversation over dinner, the tentative discussion about moving in together, about making their commitment more official and permanent. They had been dancing around the subject for weeks, both of them wanting it, but neither quite ready to be the first to suggest it. Quote 81. Carl admitted, his voice barely above a whisper, his keys still clutched in his trembling hand. Quote 82. Douglas smiled then, that brilliant smile that still had the power to make Carl's knees weak, that had first captured his attention in that conference room so many months ago. I know we said we'd take our time, that we'd wait until we were both absolutely sure. But Carl, I am sure, I've never been more sure of anything in my life. I want to build a life with you, a real life, not just stolen moments between work and sleep. Carl felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes as he listened to Douglas's words, as he saw the love and certainty shining in his expression, as he realized that this man was offering him everything he had ever wanted, but had never dared to hope for. Down, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Quote down, Douglas's eyes were bright with unshed tears as he pulled Carl into his arms, holding him close against his chest. Carl could hear the rapid beating of Douglas's heart, could feel the slight tremor in his hands as they moved over Carl's back, could smell that familiar scent that had become synonymous with safety and love and home. "Are you asking me to move in with you?" Douglas whispered into Carl's hair, and Carl could hear the smile in his voice, could feel the joy radiating from his body as he held him close. Carl pulled back slightly so he could see Douglas's face, so he could look into those beautiful brown eyes that had become his anchor in a world that suddenly made perfect sense. "I'm asking you to move in with me," he confirmed, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I'm asking you to be my partner in every sense of the word. I'm asking you to take this leap with me, to trust that what we have is strong enough to build a future on." Douglas's answer came in the form of a kiss, deep and passionate and full of all the love and commitment they had been building between them over the past 9 months. His lips moved against Carl's with a hunger and tenderness that spoke to the depth of his feelings, and Carl responded with equal fervor, pouring all of his love and hope and dreams into the connection between them. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Douglas rested his forehead against Carl's and smiled with a joy so pure and radiant that it seemed to light up the entire street around them. "Godard," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Godard." Carl felt a joy so pure and overwhelming that he thought he might burst from it, might simply dissolve into light and happiness right there on his doorstep. He had never imagined that love could feel like this, so certain and secure and full of possibility. He had never imagined that he could feel so completely himself, so completely accepted and cherished, as he did in Douglas's arms. "I love you," Carl said, the words feeling both familiar and miraculous on his tongue, as fresh and powerful as they had been the first time he had spoken them. "I love you so much it sometimes takes my breath away. I love you so much that I can't imagine a future without you in it." "I love you too," Douglas replied, his hands cupping Carl's face with infinite tenderness. Quote 94. They stood there on Carl's doorstep, holding each other in the soft glow of the porch light, and Carl felt as if they were suspended in a perfect moment, a crystallization of all the love and hope and promise that had been building between them since that first day in the office. The future stretched out before them, full of unknowns and possibilities. But Carl wasn't afraid anymore. With Douglas beside him, he felt ready for whatever came next, ready to build the life they had been dreaming about, ready to love and be loved with the kind of openness and honesty that had transformed them both. As they finally made their way inside, Douglas's hand warm in his, Carl reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. It had started with a simple question about attraction, a moment of vulnerability and honesty that had opened the door to everything that followed. It had continued through months of careful exploration and discovery, of learning to trust not just each other but themselves, of finding the courage to embrace a love that neither of them had been looking for but both had desperately needed. The apartment felt different somehow as they entered together, charged with the weight of the commitment they had just made to each other, transformed by the knowledge that it would soon belong to both of them in ways both practical and emotional. Carl moved to turn on the lights while Douglas closed the door behind them, and for a moment they just stood there, looking at each other across the familiar space that would soon be truly theirs. "This is really happening," Douglas said, his voice filled with wonder as he took in the living room with new eyes, already imagining how they would arrange their combined belongings, how they would make this space reflect both of their personalities and preferences. "We're really doing this. We're really doing this," Carl confirmed. And then they were moving toward each other again, drawn together by a magnetic force that had been building between them since the beginning, since that first handshake in the conference room that had started everything. This time when they kissed, it was with the knowledge that they were no longer just dating, no longer just exploring the possibility of a future together. They were committed now, partners in the truest sense, ready to intertwine their lives in ways both practical and profound. The kiss was different from all the others they had shared, deeper and more meaningful, infused with the weight of promises made and futures envisioned. Douglas's hands moved to the buttons of Carl's shirt, his fingers working slowly, deliberately, as if he wanted to savor every moment of this new beginning, every touch that marked the transition from what they had been to what they were becoming. Carl's own hands found the hem of Douglas's sweater, pulling it up and over his head, revealing the familiar landscape of Douglas's chest and shoulders that he had mapped with his hands and lips so many times before, but which somehow felt new and exciting in this moment of commitment and promise. But tonight felt different, charged with a significance that elevated every touch, every caress, every whispered endearment. They moved together toward Carl's bedroom, their clothes falling away piece by piece, their mouths finding each other again and again as if they couldn't bear to be apart for even a moment, as if they needed to maintain constant contact to believe that this was really happening. When they finally came together on Carl's bed, their bodies intertwining in the familiar dance of desire and love, Carl felt as if he was experiencing it all for the first time. The sensation of Douglas's skin against his, warm and smooth and perfect, the taste of his mouth, sweet and intoxicating, the sound of his breathing growing ragged with want, everything felt heightened, more intense, more meaningful. They made love with a tenderness and passion that left them both breathless, their bodies moving together in perfect synchronization, their hands and mouths exploring and worshiping with a reverence that spoke to the depth of their commitment. Every touch was a promise, every kiss a vow, every moment of connection a building block in the foundation of the life they were creating together. When they finally collapsed together, spent and satisfied, Carl felt a completeness that he had never experienced before, a sense of wholeness that came from being truly known and truly loved, from having found the person who made him feel like the best version of himself. They lay in the darkness afterward, their bodies still intertwined, their breathing slowly returning to normal. Douglas's head was pillowed on Carl's chest, his arm wrapped around Carl's waist, and Carl could feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against his skin, could feel the weight of his body relaxing into sleep. "I can't believe how much my life has changed since I met you," Douglas murmured into the quiet darkness, his voice soft and drowsy but filled with a contentment. "A year ago, I was going through the motions, pretending to be happy in a relationship that felt like wearing clothes that didn't fit. I thought that was just what love was supposed to feel like. Settling and comfortable, but never quite right." Carl's hand moved to stroke Douglas's hair, his fingers combing through the soft strands that were slightly damp with perspiration. "I know what you mean," he said softly. "I spent so many years feeling like I was watching my life happen from the outside, like I was playing a character in someone else's story. I never understood what people meant when they talked about feeling complete with another person." "And now?" Douglas asked, lifting his head to look at Carl in the dim light filtering through the bedroom windows, his eyes searching Carl's face with an intensity that made Carl's heart skip a beat. "Now I understand," Carl replied, his hand moving to cup Douglas's face, his thumb brushing across the sharp line of his cheekbone. "Go to table 104." Douglas smiled and leaned down to kiss him, soft and sweet and full of love, full of all the promises they had made to each other and all the dreams they were going to build together. Quote 105, he admitted when they broke apart, his voice barely above a whisper. 26, quote 27, Carl said, his voice filled with admiration and love, with gratitude for this man who had changed his entire world. Could I read is the quote button? Douglas corrected, his hand tracing patterns on Carl's chest, drawing invisible maps of affection and connection. "We've been brave together. We've figured this out together, step by step, moment by moment. That's what makes this so special, Carl. We didn't just fall into this relationship. We chose it. We built it. We fought for it when it would have been easier to ignore what we were feeling." They settled back into comfortable silence, their bodies relaxed and sated, their hearts full of love and contentment and anticipation for the future they were going to build together. Carl listened to the sound of Douglas's breathing as it grew deeper and more regular, felt the weight of his body growing heavier as sleep began to claim him. As Carl drifted towards sleep himself, he thought about the conversation they had had earlier about the nature of their love, about how they had found each other when neither was looking, about how their relationship had grown from friendship into something deeper and more profound than either had imagined possible. He thought about the courage it had taken for both of them to acknowledge their feelings, to risk the comfortable friendship they had built for the chance at something more. He thought about the patience and understanding they had shown each other as they navigated the complexities of a relationship that challenged both of their assumptions about themselves and their desires. Most of all, he thought about the future they were building together, the life they would share in this apartment and beyond. He imagined waking up next to Douglas every morning, sharing coffee and conversation over breakfast, coming home to each other at the end of long days, supporting each other through whatever challenges and joys lay ahead. The next morning dawned bright and clear, sunlight streaming through the bedroom windows and warming the tangle of limbs and sheets that Carl and Douglas had become during the night. Carl woke first, his body automatically seeking the warmth of Douglas's presence beside him, and he spent several minutes just watching Douglas sleep, marveling at the peaceful expression on his face, the way his hair fell across his forehead, the gentle rise and fall of his chest. When Douglas finally stirred, his eyes opening slowly to meet Carl's gaze, his first expression was one of pure joy, as if he was remembering all over again the commitment they had made to each other the night before, as if he was waking up to a new and wonderful reality. Code 111. Douglas murmured, his voice rough with sleep but warm with affection, with love that seemed to radiate from every word. Quote 100, Carl replied, leaning over to kiss him softly, tasting the sweetness of sleep on his lips. Quote 1 time, quote, Douglas said with a smile that made Carl's heart flutter with the same intensity it had that first day in the conference room, that first moment when he had seen Douglas and felt his world shift on its axis. They spent the morning in bed, talking about practical matters like lease agreements and moving schedules, but also about dreams and hopes for their shared future. Douglas talked about wanting to convert the spare room into a home office where he could work on his writing, where he could pursue the creative dreams he had set aside for so long. Carl mentioned his desire to set up an art studio in the apartment's sunroom, to finally give himself permission to explore the artistic side of himself that he had been neglecting for years. As they finally got up and began their day, moving around each other in the kitchen as they prepared breakfast, Carl was struck by how natural it all felt, how easily they fell into the rhythms of domestic life together. There was no awkwardness, no sense of adjustment or compromise, just a feeling of rightness that confirmed everything they had decided the night before. Over the following weeks, they began the process of officially combining their lives, a task that was both practical and deeply symbolic. Douglas gave notice on his lease and began moving his belongings into Carl's apartment, and they spent their evenings and weekends arranging and rearranging furniture, deciding which books and dishes and pieces of art would find homes in their shared space. The process of merging two separate lives into one cohesive whole was both challenging and rewarding. Each decision about where to hang a picture or which coffee maker to keep felt like an affirmation of their commitment, a small but significant step toward the future they were building together. They discovered new things about each other during this process, learned about Douglas's collection of vintage vinyl records and Carl's tendency to hoard art supplies, found ways to blend their different decorating styles into something that reflected both of their personalities. Their colleagues at work watched this process with interest and affection, noting the way Douglas and Carl seemed to glow with happiness, the way they moved through their days with a contentment and focus that was evident to everyone around them. Their supervisor commented that their work had somehow improved even further since they had begun living together, as if their personal happiness was translating into professional excellence. It's like you two have found your perfect rhythm, Jessica observed during a team meeting. You complement each other so well, both personally and professionally. It's really beautiful to watch. 3 months after Douglas officially moved in, they hosted their first dinner party as a couple, inviting friends and colleagues to celebrate their new life together. The evening was a tremendous success, with their guests commenting on the warmth and love that filled the apartment, on the obvious happiness and compatibility of their hosts. Carl had spent days planning the menu, wanting everything to be perfect for their first official entertaining as a couple. Douglas had helped with the preparations, and they had worked together in their kitchen with an ease and coordination that spoke to how well they had adapted to sharing their space and their lives. As Carl stood in their kitchen that evening, watching Douglas laugh with their friends in the living room, he felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought them to this moment. The shy, uncertain man who had walked into the marketing firm a year earlier felt like a different person entirely, transformed by love and acceptance into someone confident and secure in his own skin. The evening wound down with their guests gradually departing, leaving Carl and Douglas alone in their apartment to clean up and reflect on the success of their first official entertaining as a couple. As they worked together to clear dishes and put away leftovers, they talked about the evening, about the comments their friends had made, about the obvious joy and approval that had surrounded them throughout the night. "I think we're good at this," Douglas said as he loaded the last of the wine glasses into the dishwasher, his movements efficient and practiced after months of sharing kitchen duties. "I think we're good at being a couple, at building a life together, at creating a home that feels welcoming and warm." "I think so too," Carl agreed, moving to wrap his arms around Douglas from behind, resting his chin on Douglas's shoulder and breathing in the familiar scent that had become synonymous with home and safety and love. Quote 120. Douglas leaned back into Carl's embrace, his hands covering Carl's where they rested against his chest. Quote 121. He said softly, his voice filled with wonder and contentment. Quote 20 and quote fun. Carl tightened his arms around Douglas, feeling the truth of those words resonate in his own chest, feeling the same sense of authenticity and rightness that had characterized their entire relationship. He admitted, they stood there in their kitchen, holding each other in the warm glow of the overhead lights, surrounded by the evidence of the life they had built together. The apartment felt like home in a way that Carl's previous living spaces never had, filled with the combined energy and love of two people who had found in each other everything they had been searching for without even knowing they were searching. As they finally made their way to bed that night, Carl reflected on the unexpected nature of their love story, on how it had begun with a simple question about attraction and evolved into something deeper and more profound than either of them had imagined possible. He thought about the courage it had taken for both of them to acknowledge their feelings, to risk everything for the chance at real happiness, and he felt a deep appreciation for the man sleeping beside him who had been brave enough to ask the questions that changed everything. The future stretched out before them, full of possibilities and promise, and Carl felt ready for whatever came next, secure in the knowledge that he and Douglas would face it together, as partners in every sense of the word, as two people who had found in each other the missing piece that made them whole. Their love story had begun with uncertainty and fear, but it had grown into something beautiful and lasting, something that would sustain them through whatever challenges and joys lay ahead.